Hello everyone, welcome back. How's it going? Today I wanted to do a book review, give some final thoughts on The Power Broker by Robert Caro, Robert Moses, and the Fall of New York. As you can see, this is a big book. It's a classic of nonfiction. I'll talk about why that is. And it took me probably 7 or 8 weeks or so to go through it. So I started out really slow, going really slow, and I kind of picked up speed as I went along. So it was, yeah, that's usually my process for reading books, big books especially. But anyway, this book is over 1,200 pages long. It's a benchmark of modern nonfiction. It was published in 1974. It was written by Robert Caro, who was a journalist who spent years working on the book, interviewing people, going through public records, government records, newspapers, a lot of research, and a lot of just talking to people to tell this story. And who was Robert Moses? Who certainly, if you live in New York City, I think if you live in that part of the country, Robert Moses, people know who Robert Moses was because he really shaped that region of the country, specifically New York City. He was he shaped the infrastructure. He was in charge of parks, highways, roads, dams, bridges. Really was responsible for shaping what a modern city should look like, flaws and all, whether the good things, the innovative things that Moses did, but also some of the unpleasant legacies that Moses left behind as well. At the center of the book is the question of how could a man who was never elected to office command so much power? And in the introduction, Carol really goes into that, where just giving you where Moses lived like a king. He lived like an emperor, Louis the 14th, or anyone you name it. He really in time grew his own political machine that had the power to go over a mayor's head or even a governor's head, even taking on the president of the United States at one point in his career. So he had a very powerful organization, and the book really gets into talking about that. The book really gets into the machinations of city and state government. The nuances of navigating bureaucracies, the power of personalities and interpersonal relationships, the cultivation of public opinion, the Byzantine flow of money. That's a big part of what politics is. To understanding politics is how money works, who controls the money, and where does the money go is a big question. And finally, just the nature of power itself and what it does to someone. What it does to their psyche. So, yeah, and I think the question of why does one pursue power? Is it to make the world a better place? Is it just for greedy or selfish reasons, or that idealism versus selfish things? And Carol really blurs that question in the book, where it gets very complicated, and that's one of the impressive things the book does. A little bit on the background of Robert Moses, and I don't want to summarize the entire book because there's just so much packed into this book, so much detail. And like I said, it's not necessarily just a book about Robert Moses. It's a history of the state of New York, but specifically New York City at the time, and the personalities who were shaping the city. But Moses grew up in a middle-class Jewish family in New York City. He was well educated. He went to Yale and went to Oxford. He was initially an idealist. He was very interested in politics and wanted to do something with urban development, city development, things like that. So he had a really good education. He was quite brilliant, brilliant student. At Oxford, though, he did kind of get this elitism and this, and by that I'll talk about that more. Like the idea that those with the means, those who are wealthy, should be the ones who make the decisions that govern society. So that was one of the things he picked up in his education. But once he started working, he worked with. This is like in the early 20th century, like in 1914 and going into the 1920s. New York City had an exploding population. The progressive movement was a big part of America at this time. Which was about reforming the way cities were managed, how to manage huge populations that were growing fast, and how to make government work better, work efficiently, to provide the services that a growing population needed. And Moses was very much part of the progressive approach to reform. So his ideas initially were not met with much respect. His arrogance and his abrasive way of dealing with people rubbed quite a few the wrong way. So by age 30, he was really not going anywhere with his career until he forged a relationship with Al Smith, who would become governor of New York, would become a very important politician in New York's history. And Al Smith was a reformer, very much of the progressive mindsets. And he saw potential in Moses, and Moses became a close advisor to Al Smith, who would famously be the Democratic candidate for president in 1928 and lose that election to Herbert Hoover, right? Al Smith was the first, he was Irish, and they were an odd couple too, because Moses had this kind of more sophisticated background, and Al Smith was really from the Bowery Irish, and rose up really. It was like a real rags to riches story, in the Real Deal with Al Smith. He was the first Catholic to be a presidential candidate or major candidate, and of course he lost. And there was a lot of anti-Catholic propaganda put out when Al Smith ran for president. But it is an interesting counterfactual. If Al Smith had won the president, how that would have affected the career of Robert Moses. It might have went into a different direction. But as governor, Smith gave Moses widespread powers over shaping the parks of New York and building the highways of New York. This is the start of car culture. We're in the 1920s now, and Long Island was really the main focus of Moses in those days, of building beaches, building roads so people from the city could go have leisure time. And, because before this, people could go to the beaches, but it was a very difficult, you had traffic jams and it was very difficult. But Moses built these incredible beaches. Jones Beach, the most famous beach that Caro talks about. And, there was also a little bit of foreshadowing where to build the roads, Moses is infringing on people's property, and that would become a big issue later. But this was, part of, Moses felt it was the state's prerogative to take property away from people to build infrastructure, and that would be an ongoing controversy throughout his career. Moses had a great legal mind. He knew how legislation worked. He could draft legislation. He had a encyclopedic knowledge of how laws had been passed and about the law itself. So he was quite skillful in drafting laws, and he became a very important figure in New York politics by the end of the 1920s. So Al Smith loses the presidency, but Moses remains in place. I'm really in charge of the infrastructure of New York at this time. He's mastered the bureaucracy, and he has widespread powers. And it's really in the 1930s when he's overseeing really major projects, building bridges. The Triborough Bridge in New York, which was launched in 1936, which connected three boroughs, and just an incredible feat of engineering and doing this. But Moses is building bridges all over the city and developing highways and roads as well. He's also kind of building his own political machine at this time and consolidating his power, and also hit the public relations side of it, where Moses got really good press. He was friends with the owners of the New York Times, and he always got favorable coverage in the media, and that was a big part of his appeal as well. Caro spends a lot of time on Moses had a rivalry with Franklin Roosevelt, who, of course, would be elected president in 1932. And not to get too much into that, but Roosevelt was from upstate, and Moses was from the city, so that might have been part of the rivalry. But their two personalities also clashed quite a bit, and there was one moment in FDR's presidency where he tried to get a little revenge on Moses by cutting some of his federal funding, and that didn't work out too well for FDR. So that's one of the interesting subplots in the story that we get into. But by the book, of course, gets to the 1940s, into the World War II years, and afterwards, where Moses is developing all these highways and parkways and dams, and people are observing his methods, studying his methods as far as developing roads and things like that. By the 1950s, though, there began to be some pushback to Moses, really at the height of his power, where the big thing he wanted to do was build a highways, 6-lane highways, actually through cities, and which meant clearing lots of people out. And there was a part of the Bronx, the Tremont region of the Bronx, which was a very proud community, mostly Irish and Jewish families lived there, and they were told they had to get out. This is thousands of people to build the highway, and it was a whole thing. It went on where Moses refused to compromise. He didn't necessarily have to build the highway there and clear people out, but and Caro has a whole chapter where he talks about what the people had to go through, were leaving their homes, and it was really a tragedy. Moses really didn't care, though. He saw it all as progress, and if his favorite phrase was, to make an omelet you have to break a few eggs. So today we might call that collateral damage, okay? But that's a real strength of the book, though, where Caro maintains the perspective of the people who were affected by what Moses was doing in the city. Also, I mentioned the class bias that Moses had. Like, he built hundreds of parks throughout the city, but a lot of them were more in white middle class areas of the city, whereas Puerto Rican sections, Harlem, black sections of the city were not getting those modern parks that other parts of the city were getting. So there was a real big time bias in Moses in the way he was developing the city. The state was pouring so much of its resources into roads and highways, while other things like schools and hospitals were not getting the funding that they needed, okay? And even the subway system, which was built in New York City in the early 20th century, prior to Moses, languished a bit. And there was just, once again, I mentioned how the book enforces money and politics, and the long-term effects of all those things is one thing the book really does well. Especially with Long Island, and Moses did not provide mass transit for people to go from Long Island to the city. He built highways instead, which condemned Long Island to decades, maybe longer, of traffic jams. For commutes, many people had to commute to the city, and I think that persists to this day. Whereas if you had more mass transit, it would have freed up the highways somewhat. And there's a long section where Moses talks about like the one railway that moved from Long Island to New York, and just how in disrepair it was, and how spending an hour in this train, this is like in the 1940s and 50s, was just absolutely disgusting. The conditions of these trains, they weren't heated well, there was no air conditioning, so just the when you leave mass transit languishing, and things like that happen. But like Moses was all about bridges and highways. That was always his solution to do it, to fix things. But to talk about the writing of the book, like it really is literary at times. Caro uses a lot of long paragraphs at times, whether it's if he's talking about toll booth revenues or bureaucratic processes. They all have an energy to them, these paragraphs. Some sections of the book are like a political thriller, where it's a lot of dialogue and short paragraphs, and you feel like you're in this when he's talking about the corruption and some of the journalism in the 50s that was starting to cover what Moses was doing. There's almost a Dickensian, like a Charles Dickens, to the early parts of the book, where Caro was describing early 20th century New York City and the people. There's some parts read like a New Yorker profile when he's doing biographical sketches of people in the orbit of Moses. There's an entire chapter on Moses had an older brother named Paul, who was also brilliant, but had a lot of bad luck in his life. And Caro gets into the story of what looks like a horrible betrayal between these two brothers, and I won't get into that, but it's quite a story. Paul Moses and his ordeal and what he went through, and that has a literary quality to it as well, like a tragedy. So yeah, but sometimes I notice Caro as well. He really he's really precise in his language at times, going for the utmost clarity and logic but really using rhetoric well. This is one example when he's writing about the highways of Long Island, when they were planning the highways and what to do. The time was now before the expressway was built, to ensure not only that the rapid transit would be provided for, but that it would be used by enough people to ease the transportation burden from the backs of people all over Long Island. It would not be possible once the expressway was built. Build the Long Island Expressway with mass transit, or at least provision for the future installment of mass transit, and Long Island might remain a good place to live and play. Build the Long Island Expressway without mass transit, and Long Island would be lost, certainly for decades, possibly for centuries, possibly forever. So that's, yeah, and Caro's really good at that, of really being clear, really laying out the issue, explaining all of these complicated bureaucratic and money things, and all the intricate web of relationships in city politics and all that. Very good at explaining all that, but keeping it clear, okay? And there's a lot of detail in the book, and that's one of the... It can be a little bit overwhelming at times, but if you stick with it, I think it's rewarding. There's also a real humanistic strain to the book, where Caro is really focused on not just the people in power, but the people who had to live with the consequences of their power, how it affects everybody, not just a kind of a, like the cliche of the great man biography. He's really focused on how it affected everybody, okay? There's also, I think, a critique in the book of political science, and there's one part of the book where Caro mentions specifically a work of political science that was written in the 60s, a monograph or something, where it was describing the politics of New York City, and it just kind of created this picture of everything being logical. It was like this really functioning organic system, and the book missed so much. It didn't. Moses had so much power, but it seemed to be in plain sight. No one could really see just how far his power was, and political science at the time really couldn't account for that. It relied too much on systematic thinking, and it really did not discount the power of personalities and relationships and choices and how decisions are made, in the background, and not everything is in the newspapers. So there is that interesting humanistic strain in the book that the deep research reveals. Carol seems to be saying that to understand how power works anywhere, it requires a lot of research, and not relying on statistics and analysis on things of that nature. It's you need to have a bit more than mere data to explain politics. You need a knowledge of people and all that. So it's a really democratic approach the book takes. I think the book is still very relevant today. I mean, I think if you look around the world now, we still live at the mercy of very powerful people, almost all overwhelmingly men who command great wealth, and unfortunately have a lot of power over everybody's lives, which is unfortunate. Moses had this cult of personality that he had built, and there's one section in the book where, especially in the 50s, where he was at the height of his power, where he had a huge staff that would see to, would make sure everything was provided for him, and this is his staff, and these were adults, people 30s, 40s, and 50s, would have like anxiety attacks if the room temperature wasn't right and Moses was coming into the room. He was known for his harsh temper, and he was pretty much harsh with everybody. A lot of people thought that Moses really didn't like anybody, really. But he could also be very charming. He could also, and surprisingly charitable even at times. But that gives you an extent of how he affected people, where they're freaked out if the room temperature's not right, and he is going to, pay a visit. So that was kind of funny, actually, mostly funny stuff like that. But yeah, just the cult of personality and how that's always been, I think, a problem throughout the past, and it's still very much with us today. So I think the book is very instructive on that front. And I think the book, it transforms power from an abstraction into something very visible and human and tangible. And I think Caro really succeeds on that as well with the power broker. And yeah, just a book about how power is used and how power can be abused. But yeah, like I said, it's a big book. But I've actually had this book for many, many years. It sat on my shelf, and I never read it. I think I had tried to read it a long time ago, and I didn't get through it. But this time, I did, and it's very much worth it. And I think it holds a lot of relevance for today, even though the book is 50 years old at this point. So, yeah. So, thanks for watching. I will talk to you later.